Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Fillmore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 261, The Friendship Club. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, my friend, this is one of the greatest episodes we get to do because it really is about friendship. It's what you and I have had for, well, probably longer than either of us care to think about. But it's the basis of the Sherlock Holmes stories themselves, so it should be fun.
Yes, I agree.
And this is the final episode of Season 5 as we close out the year 2021. We will be beginning Season 6 next week, as we do this every week and release it to you. We will have a series of featured episodes, themed episodes every month. So stay tuned for that announcement next. And we also have a very special episode to wrap up the year for our patrons, people that support us on Patreon, which is available in the show notes. We will be releasing that episode on New Year's Eve. So stay tuned for that very special episode of Trifles brought only to our supporters. For as little as $1 a month, or whatever you can afford, that gives you access to this special content. And stay tuned because next year we're going to be making an announcement about additional special content and features for our Patreon supporters as well. So get on the bandwagon now while it's still fresh before it really gets all rotten. Well, friendship it is. What a great note on which to end Season 5. You know, we talk about so many of the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and we've really left the elephant in the room until the end of the year. Holmes and Watson, they were brought together out of convenience, out of necessity, when we found that the two of them met or were introduced in A Study in Scarlet. Thank you, Stamford, for that instrumental role in introducing Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And what we had here was two professionals, one who was up and coming, another who was returning from the war and looking for something to do to busy himself. And he happened to have some writing skills. And what began as a relationship of convenience turned into a professional relationship, but ended in friendship as well. And I think we've mentioned this before, that Julia Rosenblatt, the noted Sherlockian adventuress of Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street Irregular, once said that when it comes to Sherlockians getting together, it began with Sherlock Holmes, but it ended in friendship. And that's really, I think, a wonderful way to kind of kick off this episode about friendship.
And it's one of the reasons why the Sherlock Holmes stories are such a magnet for building friendships, because the thing that all of us, I think, have in common, all of our listeners, and certainly Scott and I and all of the other people around the world who have fun with the literature of Sherlock Holmes, is that when you share that with someone else, when you get into discussions, when you ask these sorts of questions, when you apply your own imagination, when you bring forth, your sense of reality against the actions and events in a Sherlock Holmes stories and question them, you build wonderful friendships, because let's face it, there are only certain people enjoy this sort of thing. And it's just been going on for such a long time. And we've built so many great, long-lasting friendships. That's the lovely part of it, particularly here through Trifles. The people that we hear from, the listeners that we hear from, the people that write in and contribute things and make suggestions are part of a growing, expanding community of friends. Yeah. And it's a great topic for the end of the year.
It is. And, it's hard to imagine this hobby, this avocation for some people as happening alone. I don't think we could do this show if it were just me or if it were just Bert. I don't think any of the great Sherlockian scholarship would come without bouncing ideas off of other people. And just in kind of underscoring that, we found a piece from the 1958 Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual called The Friendship Club by Charles E. Lauterbach. And this is a piece he wrote in 1958. And there were various sections to it that had to do with acknowledging the friendship of Holmes and Watson. So Bert, in honor of that, because his opening paragraph is a nod to the founder of the Baker Street Irregulars and someone who really represented bringing kinsprits or kindred spirits together to celebrate, why don't you kick things off?
Oh, thank you. Well, in Lauterbach's paper, The Friendship Club, he begins with a quote from Christopher Morley from his introduction to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The convention of accepting Holmes and Watson as real passed beyond argument long ago. They have the reality that accrues only to the great symbols and cartoons. There are no haggling comparisons in that realm of life beyond life. The detective and the doctor move with all the other great pairs of masculine good humor, with Don Quixote and Sancho, with Crusoe and Friday, with Jim Hawkins and John Silver, with Huck and Tom. Their adventures are a textbook of friendship.
Isn't that marvelous? I mean, it's just a wonderfully compact paragraph that packs in a pithy observation about the core of why we keep returning to the Holmes and Watson stories. If it was just Holmes himself, which it was in a couple of tales, if that's all the 60 stories were, I don't think they'd be as interesting. I mean, if you wanted to read them as a series of scientific lectures, as Holmes hoped people would do one day, sure. But Watson's talent is in bringing the eye of a friend and colleague. And that's one thing that always stood out to me, was when Holmes introduced Watson as my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. I think that, and there were a number of times when that happened in the canon, as early as, A Scandal in Bohemia. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who is occasionally good enough to help me in my cases. Right, so right out of the gate, you had Holmes referring to Watson not just as a roommate, but as a friend and colleague, elevating him to the point of an equal. And for us, for the readers, Watson was our equal, because we certainly couldn't equal the intelligence of Sherlock Holmes, and it was his role as friend and colleague that brought us close to the action and gave us a real sense as to what was going on.
That's true. And in so many of the Trifles conversations we've had in this past year and in prior seasons, we've had the opportunity to look and see how Watson's importance as a sounding board, as someone to explain things to, as someone to get engaged in unraveling a problem, how important that became to Sherlock Holmes. In fact, in one of the cases, Holmes very explicitly says, here's where I really need you, Watson, basically. And just adds such a wonderful dimension.
It does indeed. Well, adding a dimension to this show, we are going to pause here for a brief word from our sponsor. It's all well and good to have a subscription to the Baker Street Journal. In fact, the most recent issue just recently came out and is making its way to mailboxes all over the world. But when you're looking for scholarship past rather than present, the easiest way to go about finding that is with the eBSJ. The eBSJ is a PDF archive that provides a complete set of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 all the way through 2011 on a single DVD in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages spanning the old series, the Christmas annuals, and the new series all the way through 2011. Will there be another eBSJ to update us in the last decade? Well, we certainly hope so. What format will it take? Well, that's up to you to find out. But get the eBSJ version 2 on DVD while it's still around. Find it online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. We are back acknowledging the friendship of Holmes and Watson, and wanted to return to that Charles Lauterbach piece from the 1958 Baker Street Journal Christmas Annual. Lauterbach was a noted poet and humorist when it came to the Sherlockian world. I think we referenced the Lauterbachs in a recent episode, if I'm not mistaken. He and his son had done something together. And my mind is blanking on it now because, well, it's that time of the year. It's the time of the year when we get confused about all things temporal.
Didn't he do Baker Street Ballads? Isn't that Lauterbach?
Yes, Baker Street Ballads. I don't know in which episode we might have referred to them. I'd have to go back in my notes on that one. But anyway, Lauterbach was a poet, and well, not by trade, but when it came to Sherlockians, he wrote a lot of poetry. And this one is included in the Friendship Club. I suppose that is the name of the poem, and he just used the Christopher Morley paragraph as the topper there. So we thought we would share that poem with you.
While wandering on the Sussex Downs, I sought a moment's rest beneath a bush of golden gorse, by drowsiness oppressed.
There as I sat, a mystic haze obscured the glowing sun, and fancy, faring unrestrained, a lovely legend spun.
Upon the hillside I beheld skep on skep of bees, all wafting cargoes from afar over flowery seas.
A cottage loomed against the sky upon the misty crest, and there before the portal stood a knight in armor dressed.
Beside him sat a paunchy squire upon a lop-eared ass that calmly switched a listless tail and nibbled at the grass.
A wandering knight upon the downs was a curious incident, so up the gentle slope I climbed to find out what it meant.
Before I reached the top, the two had disappeared inside. A lance stood propped against the eaves. The door was open wide.
A roar of greeting rose within as laggards came to view. "Hi, Don, old top. How's Dulcie, eh? And Sancho, how'd you do?"
The group that sat around that board will never be forgot. Disposed in pairs and smiling all, they seemed a happy lot.
And at their head there stood a chap who was both tall and thin. He looked quite stern, but in his eye there lurked a friendly grin.
Down at the other end there sat a man of 20 stone, who wriggled in a wobbly chair with sad protesting moan.
The chairman brought his gavel down. The time has come to sing. Please join me in our friendship song and make the rafters ring. And the friendship song that Lauterbach plays out here is to the tune of Tannenbaum. In friendship's name we gather here, no other names so precious. With happy smiles and voices strong, we lift our hearts in joyous song. In friendship's name we gather here, no other names so precious.
O treasured hours that we have shared in friendship's dear devotion. Together we have faced the years, sometimes in joy, sometimes in tears. O treasured hours that we have shared in friendship's dear devotion.
We pledge anew our loyalty forever and forever. True friendship gives, makes no demand. When shadows fall, holds out a hand. We pledge anew our loyalty forever and forever.
And now to business, gentlemen. Upon our sacred scroll, your honored names have long been writ. Please, Watson, call the roll.
Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, Jim Hawkins and John Silver, Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, Peter Wimsey and Mervyn Bunter, Robinson Crusoe and Friday, Sherlock Holmes and Watson, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Some names I could not understand. I was outside, you see. But those I heard I've jotted here. A famous company.
The big man at the end still squirmed upon his weary chair and fidgeted with nervous fear, a picture of despair.
Then sudden came an awful crash. The chair could take no more. Archie! There rose a frenzied cry, and Nero hit the floor.
Amidst this wild phantasmal rout, the spell went pfft, of course, and there was nothing left at all, except a clump of gorse.
I roused myself. The sun was low athwart a crimson sky, and on my nose there sat a bee with mischief in his eye.
How fun. How fun.
Just another example, of all of the terrific threads in the world of Sherlock Holmes and in all the cross interests, too. People who are also interested in P.G. Wodehouse and many of these other writers. For example, Stephen Fry, who's played Mycroft and has recorded the cases of Sherlock Holmes, is also a poet and has written a couple of wonderful books about poetry, including sort of an instructional book about poetry. And it's just lovely to see this love of words come out and to revisit some of these great characters.
Mm. Yeah, it almost reminded me of some of the cameos from, or the featured players, I should say, in that spoof film Murder by Death by Neil Simon. You had these wonderful pairs of detectives and sidekicks, or two detectives together. It's a wonder that Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin didn't appear in that play and film.
Yeah, that's true. Well, he had Dom DeLuise in there, didn't he?
Yeah, he was.
He had James Coco.
James Coco as Poirot. Yeah, the Poirot stand-in. Yeah. So, well, what a wonderful model on which to base other detective duos. In my thinking, I don't believe there was any other duo from detective fiction before Holmes and Watson, if I'm not mistaken. You had Dupin, you had from Poe, you had Wilkie Collins, the Moonstone. Those inspectors were typically loners, if I was not mistaken.
Well, I think Dupin had somebody to talk to, didn't he? I'll have to go back and take a look.
My Dupin is a trifle rusty, I'm afraid.
I tried to cook poached eggs in my Dupin, and I just, for some reason, they stuck on the bottom.
Well,
I can't figure that out.
a little steel wool, and that'll take the rust right out of your Dupin. Yeah.
Thank goodness.
Indeed. Well, folks, thank you for joining us here again for another season of Trifles. This is the final episode. As we said, we will be back in 2022 with season 6. My goodness, it's hard to think that we're on to season 6, beginning with our 262nd episode in January. It has been a treat to be with you all year long. Bert, it's been a treat to be with you, dear listener, all year long, and we hope that you will invite us into your inbox and into your ears in 2022. And that's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Brunton!
Mr. Holmes, a pleasure to see you again.
My friend and colleague, Dr. Watson.
Welcome to Herschel, sir.
Musgrave. My friend and colleague, Dr. Watson.
So glad. It's a long time.
Yes. And how has all gone with you?